Hello there, welcome to this, I think it might be one of the last sessions here at the festival. The last, there we are. So apologies for that. But my name is Jonathan Freedland, I write for The Guardian newspaper, and I will be moderating / taming this panel for this session. A wonderfully eclectic bunch of people incredibly well placed to grapple with the questions, which I think are broadly summarised as Brexit, Corbyn, etc. And we've certainly got expert voices on the etc. and people with some wisdom to share on Brexit and Corbyn and all matters in British politics. Let me just introduce them and then we're going to plunge straight in. I will go this way round, starting with the former speechwriter for Tony Blair and Times columnist Philip Collins. Thank you very much. Historian and Member of Parliament for Spelthorne, which I'm told is just 5 miles away from here as the crow flies, Kwasi Kwarteng. The ringmaster of the must-listen Economist radio and ubiquitous political commentator Anne McElvoy. Also political commentator but editor of the Jewish Chronicle as well, Stephen Pollard. And of course, known to many of you here, the Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine. So that is our panel. I'm going to try and keep this extremely tight and disciplined because I'm going to give really just a minute each, because these are people who could talk for much longer. On the opening two-part question, so really you need 30 seconds for each half. See how you can do. The question I'm going to put to each of them, and we'll hear from each of them first before they have a chance to come back and start criticising each other, is how should we Brexit and how will we Brexit? So these are two very different questions. How should we be leaving the European Union? If we should. You can take that whichever way you like. But then to ask you to play Mystic Meg, I want you to say how you think we will. And of course, these things might be different. And I'm going to go from this way. Sarah Vine, why don't we start with you? How should Britain Brexit, and how do you think we actually will?
I think the most important thing is that we don't crash out. Vital, because I think that would be a complete disaster. So we do need some kind of deal. And how will we Brexit? I think probably messily, not how most people would have wanted. It will be a question of not, as my husband likes to say, not making the perfect the enemy of the good. So it will be a compromise, I think, on many levels.
Can you be more concrete?
So Kwasi's like, Kwasi's out of his seat.
It's already too concrete for Kwasi. But could you just be a tiny bit more concrete on what form? In other words, whether it will be Canada or Norway or single market or customs union?
I mean, I quite like Norway. I've never been to Canada. So I don't know. It's not up to me. I'm not in charge of the details.
No, it's just how we should and how we will.
That's the way we pay the politicians, right? And they seem to have made such a hash of it. So I'd like to see a little bit,
I'm sure you don't think all the politicians
No, I do actually think most of them, yeah.
There might be one exception, or one in particular. Stephen Pollard, how should we Brexit? How will we Brexit?
I would rather that we Brexit in a sort of free trade agreement with the EU. That would be my preference. How will we? This is from the person who thought that it was impossible for Jeremy Corbyn to get more than 25% of the votes at the last election. So when it comes to political forecasting, I haven't got a clue. I'll evade the question slightly by saying I think rather than how will we, I think the important thing is that we do. In that I think the rise of Jeremy Corbyn is worrying enough in terms of extremism and those kinds of issues. I think were we to say to 52% of the electorate, you know what, your vote doesn't count, and we don't, then I'd be even more worried for the future of our democracy. Okay,
Anne, on those two questions, the old is-ought distinction that we were taught, how should we, how will we?
So I would have no hesitation in just serving up the Norway option if I thought there was a remote chance of sticking to it, if I thought there was a remote chance of it getting through. Why? Because I'm one of those people who does believe in respecting the vote. I don't really like the way of going at Brexit that says, like, just that I didn't want it to happen, so how do we stop it happening just because I didn't vote for it? So I like something that delivers Brexit. I think that's quite important. Sarah talks about the dangers of crashing out. I think she's completely right about that, but I think there are, if you like, hidden rocks of not delivering something that a majority of people, albeit narrowly, but actually quite a number of people does actually separate the Leavers from Remainers in the last referendum. Norway satisfies that because it would allow us to remain close to trading patterns with our single biggest trading partner, and being from The Economist, I can see that that's a pretty good idea. I think it's very hard to deliver Norway, not least because Norway doesn't particularly want us to share that status, but it's still, I think, the kind of deal to aim for. So for that reason, I'm probably less appalled by Chequers than some other people on the panel. And you said, how will we exit? We've had messily. I think I'm going to go for slowly, contrary to what we think now. Because I think whatever happens, and I don't feel my prognostication is worth any more than Stephen described his own rather modestly, but I think whatever happens, we're going to have a so-called transition period of 2 years after next March. And I doubt that we'll really know the final shape of Brexit until those 2 years are up.
Just 2 years, you think?
Well, I think at some point something's got to have happened or not happened.
Yeah.
So I think it will still be contentious, but one will be able to say it happened or is happening in this way, not that way, Mr. Pedantic Chairman.
Thank you. So you're in the unique position on this panel of actually having a vote on this when it comes to the House of Commons, because the rest of us don't. So.
Well, you're very free with your opinions.
There's an extra weight here to your answers to how should we, and then how will we.
I think that we should definitely Brexit. How it's delivered was always going to be contentious. We've had two very significant votes in the last 3 years. One was a 52-48%, which was narrow, and then of course we had a general election which came up with a hung parliament. So, given those two votes, given that they were both close, one was, the general election was inconclusive, we were always going to have a slightly murkier, more difficult process than people thought, particularly Conservatives like myself who thought we were going to get a big majority last year. So that didn't happen. And as soon as the exit poll came out, a friend of mine turned to me and said, well, that's Brexit. I mean, I can't say what he said, but he implied that the Brexit process would be much more difficult than we anticipated.
Did he put it more robustly?
Yeah, he put it lots of Anglo-Saxon words. And he wasn't very happy. He was someone who was consistently for Brexit. Now I think we're in the end game, as it were, because I think we're going to get a deal. I think there's a lot of play acting, frankly. I think there's a lot of kabuki theatre, but there will be a deal. And then the big question is whether the deal gets through the House of Commons. And I think the deal will get through the House of Commons by hook or crook. Whereas if you read the papers now, they all say, oh, well, Chequers is dead. I don't think it's dead. I think it came out of quite a lot of consensual conversations, not least with European partners. And so I think at the end of all the negotiation and all the noise and all the drama, we will come up with a deal which isn't that far from Chequers. And the last thing I'd say about this is that we're living through, I mean, it's such a cliche, but it's a process, it's not an event. We're living through a process of trying to reorganize our relationship with Europe. We're never going to know on the 1st of January next year or the 1st of January the year after what that process involved. It would be like being in the middle of the French Revolution and being asked, so what do you think of the French Revolution now? I mean, it took decades for it to sort out. So I think we're going in the right direction. I think we're going to leave the EU formally, and I think it'll take a bit of time working out exactly what the nature of our relationship with Europe will be after Brexit.
Definitely things I want to follow up on that, but let's go to Philip. How should we and how will we?
Well, despite being a Remain voter and thinking that most of the Leave campaign was based on an extraordinarily simplistic idea of an old-fashioned notion of sovereignty, I think that we should leave the European Union, for the reason Anne gave, which is that we voted to do so in a referendum whose rules we knew, and we should implement that referendum. So I think that we should, first. I also think that we will. Now, how should we? If we were going back in time and Norway was still available, that would be my preferred option, but it's not. So the question has to start from where we sit today. And I agree with Kwasi. I don't think Chequers is dead. at all. I think what will happen is that it will have to be mangled and distorted in such a way as that people who don't like checkers can call it something else, and people who do like checkers can call it something else, but with checkers in the title. Because that's what always happens. If you ask yourself a totally unanswerable question, like the Irish border question, you end up going around in circles, not being able to answer it. So the only sensible thing to do is stop asking the bloody question. It can't be answered. What you have to do instead is find some sort of deal that will not satisfy anybody who has even a dictionary definition of the understanding of the word deal. You get some sort of compromise mess that enough people can live with. And that's what I think we should do. And I also agree with Kwasi that my best guess is that is what we will do. I think that it's going to be, we're going to end with a whimper rather than a bang. I think there will be a deal. I'm more confident about that first part of it. I think there will be a deal. And I think, on balance, though with no degree of certainty, that deal will squeak through the House of Commons.
So to my surprise, none of you have said that we should Brexit if we do after a second referendum or people's vote on it. And so for the sake of argument, I would make that argument that the way we should Brexit if we're going to is after having another chance to vote on it, because you wouldn't say, I've bought this, I like that house around the corner, I might buy it, but I'm definitely not going to have a survey. I'm just going to write the check out right now because I've just made the decision to move. You first make the decision to move, and then you make the decision about which house you're moving to.
The reason I'm
so we need a
opposed to
second
that,
vote.
where you might think I wouldn't be, is I think it's disingenuous. I actually agreed with Len McCluskey that if you were to have a vote on the terms of our departure, various forms of departure, well, then I could see that's not a second referendum, that's a new vote. But actually what you really want is, I don't like the first one, I want the chance of winning again.
That's right.
Second time.
But would a people's vote be legitimate if it was just on the terms of the departure?
I just want to say, I think you have to see Brexit in the context of the Tory party and of the Labour Party. So it's not an isolated incident. And one of the reasons we're in so much difficulty is because the Tories are in so much difficulty and have had so many different currents coming this way and that. And I think there is a case. I think that there is one school of thought that says that the best thing that May can do now is to go to Brussels, get a deal, which will struggle to get through Parliament because it will be neither fish nor fowl nor good red herring, and everybody will be unhappy with it because the Remainers won't like it, the Leavers won't like it, Corbyn's going to vote against it because he just wants to trigger a general election anyway. And then what she could theoretically do is put a referendum to the people to say, OK, let's Brexit it on these terms or remain. And that would, in fact, give a second referendum. And that would work very well for her, because then if people vote to remain, then job done, she's a Remainer anyway, great, hurrah, we stay in, assuming they'll have us back, which I suspect they probably would. Or, we go on the terms that she has negotiated, and therefore Parliament can't block it. So she's got them checkmated.
See, intellectually...
But I don't know if that's...
I don't see how there's no time for all of that.
Intellectually, I can see, as a Brexiteer, I can see the case for a second referendum. I can see the logic. I can see, yes, it's not. But politically, I think it's toxic. Politically, it says to 52% of the country, which has happened every time there's been a referendum in the EU, which has gone the wrong way, according to the Europhiles, your vote doesn't count, we need to have another one. And you can argue till you're blue in the face that it's, this isn't another referendum about that. This is a referendum about the terms of leaving and blah, blah, blah. But actually what you're saying, at a time of, real fissures in British politics at the moment, you're saying to 52% of the country, we people who know better think that you need to vote again. Now, it may be that the vote goes for Brexit and that the deal, whatever deal is put to the country, wins. The advantage of that in terms of politics is nothing other than the fact that you get it through. But what happens if the vote is rejected? Then you've got an almost... I can't see how politics itself can resolve that, because you've then had 52% who voted for something being told you have to vote again, and then whatever the figures are, the whole situation just explodes.
You were about to come in.
Well, I did, and I don't think there's enough time, really, ahead of the Brexit process, because it's less than...
For a referendum.
It's 6 months now, as of today.
Yeah.
And I think once you've got the deal, And then
Well,
once
we
you've got a
can hold the
parliamentary
We
vote,
can press pause if we want to.
I think it's very difficult to
Yeah.
organise a referendum in that time.
No, but Sarah's saying you could press pause.
You
meaning
could press pause. You
By
could
delaying
hold-
Article 50
Delay
or...
Article
Yeah.
50.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
I
could
think
press
delaying
pause.
Article 50 would be a suicide note for any politician who advocated that.
Well, I mean,
I
I
think
would
it would
argue
be-
that she shouldn't have triggered it when she did.
Well,
and
it
that
has
was
been
the
triggered.
time when she signed the suicide
But-
note.
But
you
there's no
know,
Conservative Prime Minister that can do this
But-
because they wouldn't survive the process. of
No,
doing it.
and actually, I think that the whole second referendum thing, I think, is disingenuous because the only people, most of the people who say it just want to rerun it so they could win this time, and it smacks too much of asking the electorate to do the homework again.
Though they would.
This
wouldn't
isn't
they,
good.
Kwasi?
This
It's
is
been such a
I don't
total
think they would. I don't
shambles.
think they would. I don't think
They probably would,
I don't
because
think they
it's been
would.
such a shambles.
I mean, I'd love to bet you on that. I don't think they would. I think.
Okay, well,
I think Leave would probably win by more. That's my.
well, I
thought.
think that would go.
Everyone,
Okay,
has a
let's hear
cognitive,
it. Yeah.
everyone has a cognitive bias on this, and if you're convinced that the public is where you are on Leave, as Kwasi is, he's convinced that Leave would win by an even larger
I talked to vote. I talked to my electorate.
Now, it
and
might
all the
surprise you that
Remainers-
journalists also sometimes kind of talk to people.
Well,
but,
not
but
not
just
outside London.
Well, as I come from County Durham, it would put me out
Okay,
of contact
okay,
with a lot of my
your family, I'm
family,
sorry,
right?
I'm sorry, I'm
so,
sorry about
yeah, well, we won't do that one. So
No, we should
there
do
is-
that one because I mean
Well,
I hate
no,
this
I've just
idea
given you
that
my answer, but can I finish
that
my
Make
journalists-
the point and then Kwasi
Okay.
can hit the media. Go on.
Then you can bash the media. And it's also a little bit of a canon that media never leave them. So one of the things I think is you could do, and I think Sarah slightly trailed her coat on it, it'd be interesting if Theresa May said, one way or the other, I'm not going, she's not going to end this as Prime Minister, but she's not going to be the Prime Minister for the next period. I think that's known to everyone, including Humphrey the Downing Street cat knows that. So she might say, never mind these, ultra Remainers. Let me call that referendum. I can't get this through Parliament. I don't think I've got the votes. There seemed to be more optimism on the panel about getting it through Parliament.
Yes.
I'm interested in that, but I'm not as convinced. And you guys may know better. So she could do that. I think she's not brave enough. I think it won't happen. And also, I think there's less interest in it. All about the media bubble, God, or London, or whatever we say about people we don't like these days. I really do think there is a problem with the call being driven overwhelmingly by people who just don't really want what happened last time to happen. And if you could build a coalition of people on the other side who said, I'm a moderate Brexiteer, but I think you're right, we need a second referendum, then I think it would have more moral standing.
Yeah.
But instead, this side doubles down on more and more outrage from its own side, and that's why it's not satisfactory.
Can I just press you, Kwasi, on this thing, and Anne just mentioned it, because it did surprise me too, and there was confidence over this side, you and Philip both, that Chequers is not dead or you could get the numbers for a deal. Just to walk me through how that works, given that Labour made pretty clear last week, I mean, actually nothing they said was clear, but what emerges from Labour's thing is they're not going to vote for any deal that Theresa May would actually propose. No. You've got Jacob Rees-Mogg's group, which, yes, some people say it will come down to 15, 20 in the end, could be as much as 60. The votes are just not there to support anything she comes up with. So how does this get through the House of Commons?
So outwardly, everything you say makes sense. But the one thing that you've noticed...
Inwardly, it's all rubbish.
The one thing you've noticed, the one thing
my tombstone, I think
Jeremy Corbyn said that he sort of let a little bit of wiggle room last week.
Yeah.
I strongly suspect that the vote will come late. The vote could come as late as January.
Good.
The party managers will say to the House of Commons, you either vote for this or the chaos of a no deal. And I think it's a big deal for the Labour Party to go in the division lobby with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Bill Cash. I'm not saying it won't happen.
But it's a big deal for Jeremy Corbyn to go in the division lobby with Theresa May.
Well, then...
That her government's hanging by a thread
you're
and he says, I'm
absolutely
going to
right.
help you out.
So I can see a free vote on the Labour side. I can also see a sort of abstention. I can see that. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
putting it out there, because these are things that one doesn't really read in the media. But I know that the bill will be presented late. It'll be a binary option. There will be chaos on one side, and there will be the safety of a deal that's been ratified by all 27 EU countries, by the way. And then it'll be up to the various rebels or whoever to defy the government. And I think the Tory antis will be squeezed to maybe 15 or 20. And I think that enough people will say, you know what, we hate Brexit, but we don't want the chaos of a no deal or further chaos, and then the thing goes through. And I can see that happening.
I think Labour will vote against it. I think Labour will whip against it, irrespective of the terms of the deal. I think they were always going to do that, and I think everything they've said has been entirely phony. We've only not quite realised it's phony because it's been so incomprehensible for so long. But the Labour position will be to vote against it. I think it will be a deal which is framed as vote for this or you get nothing. And the Prime Minister will say, I'm not going to seek an extension of Article 50, so that the clock is ticking. So all of your other options just simply don't exist, not whilst I'm Prime Minister, and I am. And my party doesn't want a general election, so I'm going to stay Prime Minister. So that will be the question that people are asked. It's been astonishing
jumping off a cliff.
It's been astonishing to me that they haven't understood that's the question. They're always going to, but that's always been the case. And then what I think will happen is that enough Labour MPs will defy their own whip, either because they think it's simply illegitimate to vote against it, or because they are frightened that they're risking no deal, or because someone like Caroline Flint, they represent a place which is very heavy leave voting constituents, and they want to vote with their constituents, or like Frank Field and Kate Hoey, because they want to leave the European Union in any case. And I think there will be enough Labour rebels to more than counteract the dwindling band of Tory rebels, who I think in the end will think, we've wanted this cause all our lives. We're within touching distance of leaving the European Union. Let's just leave the European Union. And then precisely because we're going into an extended period of term bashing to try and work out what it actually means, start the fight later.
And I think there's one element which Philip mentioned briefly, which is also, you can't ignore when it comes to voting, which is the opposite of not voting for the deal isn't necessarily just no deal. It's possibly a general election, which means that Corbyn as Prime Minister. And I think for a lot of Conservative MPs and a lot of Labour MPs too, that's a gun to the head. That is worse even.
Although, how does Theresa May do that? She wouldn't say, look, the alternative is if I get no deal, I'm going to put a gun to my own head.
No, but the alternative is a House of Commons that is unmanageable. That there has, we've passed Article 50. There's no deal.
No vote of confidence. No confidence. General election.
I mean, on that, I think the general election thing is a canard.
I don't see how they would ever vote for that.
Because there are only two ways you can have a general election. One is that the government loses a vote of no confidence, and there's no Tory MP that will vote against the government on that. And the second way of doing it is having a two-thirds vote in the House, essentially rescinding the fixed term Parliament Act.
But we have a minority government at the moment. They don't. I mean,
that's all true.
There's the DUP in play. There's all kinds of issues.
As I say, the only way we can have a general election is through the two mechanisms I've described.
Yes.
Okay.
And I don't think either
Let's
of
take
them
quickly
are
from
going
Anne, and then we're going to move on to the other big topic.
I think one of the reasons why Number 10 are exaggerating the threat of a general election is because they know that it's the best chance they've got of keeping the party behind her. Sorry.
So you need the gun in your hand in order to put the gun to their head.
So you're right, Kwasi. It's not going to happen, but they like the narrative it makes it like...
The most depressing thing I think I've heard so far is what Philip said, which is that the idea that you drag this across the line so that the argument can continue.
That's what you all wanted, isn't it, really?
We're going to be trapped in Brexit hell for years and years and years.
It's the only thing they care about. They'll talk about it forever. They're the people who can't take yes for an answer.
A quick word from Anne, then we're moving on to the other big topic.
Just since I've had to manage a digital product, I now have all this kind of new jargon like anchor bias. And I think one big anchor bias, if you like, something that we're all assuming is true because we did it before, or we think of it in this way, is nobody has mentioned there could be a challenge to Theresa May between now and next year. So I just thought I would just throw that small one in there. It's not, we're talking as if Theresa May controls this narrative. I'm not completely sure that she does. I think she's got a good chance of surviving because it's too difficult for someone else just to come along with any confidence and take her job. But there is certainly agitation, and it would appear, that there is perhaps new energy behind Boris Johnson's bid. So I would not rule out the fact that our anchor might actually be being plopped down in another place.
Okay, so quickly on that,
Sarah
Vine, if Boris Johnson was a leadership candidate against Theresa May, would you support him?
I think Boris is brilliant.
That wasn't my question. Would you support him to be the party leader?
But it's not up to me because I'm not an MP.
No, but you might be have
Only
a
a
vote as
matter
a
of
Tory
time.
party member. And also, we're all asking ourselves questions here, what we support.
I don't think that will happen for the simple reason that that nobody in their right mind would want to take on the job that Theresa currently faces. I mean, even
premise
Boris,
there that Boris is on his right
even Boris,
mind.
who is a little bit bonkers, let's be honest, I think he would be better off waiting until she'd got past that particular post before actually activating any bid. There's no doubt that everybody's on manoeuvres, and I'm sure Boris will make a very cogent case. But the fact is that, she's taken so many bullets now,
Yeah.
and she's fought so hard, and she's so wounded, and what she's trying to do is so impossible and so difficult. No one in their right mind would want to take over that challenge.
You're going to, this is the last word on this thing. You yourself, you were sort of nodding at the idea that, yeah, there's not going to be a challenge.
I don't think there will be. I mean, again, the date today is the 30th of September. We've got 6 months
Exactly.
To get this whole thing wrapped up. And I think, and it's an uncertain process. So to throw in an additional measure of uncertainty on what is already an uncertain process by having a leadership contest is something that very few MPs want.
Okay.
I just think it would really annoy the electorate as well, to be perfectly honest.
That hasn't stopped MPs so far.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the second question then. I'm going to go, we went that way to this way, so we're going to go the other way. This question is, should Jeremy Corbyn be Prime Minister? Will he be Prime Minister? So we'll start with you. It's again the same drill. Keep it to a minute if you can. 2 halves of the question. Should Corbyn be Prime Minister? Will Corbyn be Prime Minister? Philip Collins.
I think it's extraordinary that you have a Labour leader having to make his conference speech in which he has to deal with accusations that he's a racist. It would be entirely ignoble for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister of this country. He's wholly unfit for that office, and he absolutely should not be leader of the Labour Party, let alone Prime Minister. He shouldn't be anywhere close to it. No, it's totally and utterly an outrageous suggestion. Will he be? Will he be? Well, if I'm wrong, and if Kwasi and I are wrong about the circumstances of us leaving the European Union, which is entirely possible because I don't put any degree of certainty on my prediction there at all. It's far too many things at play. If it is chaotic, if we do leave without a deal, or if we do sort of blunder into some parliamentary paralysis and ending with a general election, or there's all sorts of circumstances in which Jeremy Corbyn could be the beneficiary of a chaotic government. So, of course, that is all possible. However, I still think, if I'm pressed to answer yes or no, I think he won't be Prime Minister for the reasons I gave in the first half of my answer.
Kwasi Kwarteng.
So,
you're not going to surprise us with either half, are you?
No, I'm not going to suggest that Jeremy Corbyn would be an excellent Prime Minister of this country. I'm not going to say that. And actually, I don't think he will. I don't think, because I just think that the circumstances of the last election were wholly exceptional. And there was always this sense that the Tories were going to win and win easily, and people felt that they didn't want the Conservatives necessarily to have a landslide. He did mobilise people, but nobody going into the voting booth that I knew thought he had a chance of becoming Prime Minister. Very few people did that. I think in 2022, which is when I think the next election will be, they'll be terrified of the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn. Many people will be terrified of the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn. And as a consequence of that, I think people will vote against him, and he will not get that.
Is part of the premise of your calculation then that the Tory divisions in which they are fighting each other with exceptional vigour, more vigour than they fight the opposition, that those divisions will be passed then? It will be 2-3 years behind?
No, my premise is essentially that Jeremy Corbyn is a revolutionary socialist, broadly. And I don't think people in this country would be prepared for him en masse to become Prime Minister. That's. I mean, it's a gut feel. It's not very scientific, but that's what I feel. And it was very much the same thing with Ed Miliband in 2015, because at that time people thought he was going to be Prime Minister, and I remember Tony Blair saying that just isn't going to happen because the electorate isn't that left wing. And he was right.
And then you have to explain 2017, and you've done that saying those are exceptional circumstances. So should he? Will he?
Let me try and answer it slightly differently, just for variety. Should a Labour leader be Prime Minister at the next election? Yeah, I mean, a very good chance, depends obviously, who it was, but yeah, my instinct would say yes. Two parties need to change. They need time out of office to renew. The Conservative Party is tired, it is traumatised, it is divided. There are very good reasons to vote Labour at the next election, people, except Jeremy Corbyn. And so, I think you may find that we agree, but I'm trying to channel the fact that I think there will be perhaps a bit more of a feeling in the country that the Tories, have had their day, they've had their chance, we've had bugger up Brexit. Some form of dissatisfaction is going to be quite big come the next election, even if an early election is avoided. No, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn should be Prime Minister morally, practically. No one's really talked about the economy, and just fleetingly, actually, I think John McDonnell is far more of a threat to the country in some ways than Jeremy Corbyn. We're often chasing the wrong pigeon here.
A threat because he's more electable.
A
In your
threat because he
in your
makes it
terms.
all sound more reasonable, but what he proposes is so economically damaging that the Conservative Party, absolutely, for reasons that are understandable, distracted to the hilt by Brexit and trying to, and it's, let's really, what we haven't really said is they don't think Theresa May is very good, right? I mean, there are very few people on any wing of the Conservative Party who think Theresa May is any good. They just think you start with her, she's got to do this, we'll let her carry the cross. And that is not a very powerful message to take to the electorate. Therefore, economic renewal, a conservative form of redistribution, an argument about all the things she said she was going to deal with in the country, in the sense of unfairness and things grinding to a halt in too many communities, which is why Labour puts out these brilliantly effective videos, which is absolute rubbish. But one has to say they are a better, a more convincing and more alluring message to get into than anything the Conservatives are offering. So her successor is going to have to be thinking now how they're going to change that, whoever he, she, or it may be.
Okay. Stephen, you've got particular locus on this because the paper you edit has made a lot of the running on stories about Jeremy Corbyn, which go to at least the should question. So should he be Prime Minister and will he be Prime Minister?
So in August 2015, we published a leader on the front page of the JC, which posed 7 questions that were, as we put it at the time, troubling for people about Jeremy Corbyn in terms of his associations with people like the Holocaust denier Paul Eisen, his support for Hamas and Hezbollah as friends, those kinds of things. I thought when I wrote that leader in 2015 that it was sort of as bad as it got, that a man like this could become leader of the Labour Party. But if you could turn the clock back now to 2015, in a way, that was a more hopeful time because there was the chance that the Labour Party itself might have realised that it had made a mistake with Jeremy Corbyn. But it's much, much worse than that now because Jeremy Corbyn now represents the modern Labour Party. The Labour Party has changed out of all recognition, literally, because it's got new members who are Corbynites. And they are people who, by definition, are happy to have as Prime Minister a man who... I used to get asked this question a lot, do you think Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite? And the argument that the response I would always make is, I can't look into his soul, I have no idea. All I can do is judge him by his actions, and he enables anti-Semites. I've changed my response to that now. The video that emerged a few weeks ago of him referring to British Zionists as not understanding English irony was about as classic a piece of sort of middle-class, respectable anti-Semitism that as you can get. It's so typical that the Jew is, Jews have many talents, they may be wonderful people, all the rest of it, but they're not quite us. They're not really quite part of us. He's an anti-Semite. There's no doubt about that. It's clear and obvious that he has. He doesn't go around saying, I want to get rid of Jews, but he's an anti-Semite in terms of having those attitudes. And the thought that a man like that could become Prime Minister is truly horrifying. Now, to answer the second part of the question, will he? I get more and more depressed as the days go on because increasingly I think the answer has to be yes, I think he will. And I think that for 2 reasons. Number one, because we have a Conservative government that is, in my lifetime, the most incompetent government of my lifetime, that has no possible reason for re-election beyond perhaps being grateful for the fact it got Brexit through. I saw Theresa May on the Andrew Marr programme this morning. You'd think someone would have told her there is at least something she should say that's positive about a reason to vote Conservative, and there isn't one. There is no rationale as to why anyone should vote Conservative. In fact, the only rationale is why you'd want to kick this lot out. But there's another reason why I'm worried about it, which is that I think, and actually the people that I blame more than anyone else is the Labour moderates, who I think are spineless and hopeless. One by one, they get picked off in their constituencies. They get deselected, they have votes of no confidence. We had Chris Leslie, an admirable, wonderfully gifted MP, getting a vote of having a vote of no confidence on Friday night. And one by one, they get picked off and they play straight into the Corbynite hands. Can you remember who the first Labour MP was who resigned the whip? No one remembers him. He was John Woodcock. if they resigned en masse, a group of maybe 25, 30, even 45 or whatever, Labour MPs who'd said, you know what, this is not part of the Labour tradition, we're going to sit in the House of Commons as an independent Labour bloc, they would have had to elect their own parliamentary leader, they would have had credibility, they would have stuck it to the Corbynites, instead of which they're spineless and they get picked off one by one and no one will remember them because they're being blown away by history. And it's really frightening and depressing.
Thank you. So, Sarah, where are you on this? Should he be Prime Minister, and will he?
No and no.
So good, because that
So
conciseness.
you wanted short answer.
No, I mean, I did, because it gives me a chance to put something to the others who also said no and no, or at least the no to the second half, which is this too complacent? And for some of the reasons you heard from Stephen, which is every age group, apart from the over 65s, I think, voted Labour or preferred Labour to the Tories in 2017. You've even got a Tory former Tory Minister Jim O'Neill saying that Corbyn and McDonnell are capturing the spirit of our times. The rejection of austerity is so wholesale. The approval of the policy programme, renationalisation, etc., is through the roof. The confidence of this panel here and the audience here, who seem to think this is not going on, I wonder if it is going on.
But he should not be Prime Minister. Whether he becomes Prime Minister will depend almost entirely on what happens with Brexit and the Tories. Yeah. So the answer to that question is not. I cannot give you the answer to that question. If the Tories get their act together, then he could be defeated easily because, I mean, he, as Stephen's pointed out, he presides. I mean, he has a sort of regime of terror. I mean, there are lots of Labour MPs who are moderate and who are intelligent, who, if they felt that they could unite and get together, they would rise up against him. I mean, he is a totalitarian lunatic. We've seen that from his way he talks. He's full of hate. His followers are full of hate. I know this because they email me all the time. And you know, there's nothing good or joyous or positive about Labour under Corbyn, whereas that wasn't the case. You know, I mean, policies, we can all differ over those things. It's really about the tone and it's about the spirit of the thing, and I think that's the thing. But in a way, him being so resurgent is good because it will kick the Tories up the arse. They will have to do something. They will have to get their house in order.
You go there, Sarah. You go there.
They can't just carry on, you know, having this sort of, sorry, Kwasi.
I just want to put this good, and there's nothing good or joyous about it, you said, Sarah. And I'm just thinking, I was in Liverpool last week. I don't think you were there, Philip, for the conference. But you've talked before about Momentum, these other movements who are depicted as totalitarian and terrifying. And yet you have said, actually, they're idealistic people. Yeah. There is this kind of consensus, and you mentioned this very powerful TV ad that they've done about austerity, the sense that actually the mood and the times are with them.
Well, the momentum itself, you have to distinguish two different parts of it. There's a lot of young people who are attracted to politics who like to go to their conference and talk about politics and argue. And they're left-wing in the way young people are left-wing. And I went along to their conference, not this time in Liverpool, but the last time, and it was full of people having a good argument about politics. Now, what's wrong with that? You know, I couldn't find it in my heart to be miserable about that. And that they were left of centre, but it wasn't vicious. There was no nastiness. It was full of joy and full of enthusiasm, actually. And if the minute you start to complain about that, you really are in trouble. But those people are currently within the Labour Party led by a faction of hard left Leninists and Trotskyists. And the Labour Party has a deeply authoritarian streak at the best of times, and that's what worries me most about Corbyn, is that slight sense of steel. You can see it more with McDonnell, but I think it's there with Corbyn too, in the flash of anger when he's questioned on something.
Yes. Yeah.
He's not a man who's ever been questioned in all his life. He's only ever been in a room where everybody agrees with him. And the minute he encounters opposition, his default setting is to flash against it and be angry about it. So I worry about the authoritarian streak. I think that would be exhibited with respect to media criticism, for example. I don't think he respects the institutions of a liberal democracy as much as he ought to. I think he is besetting sin, Mr. Corbyn, is that he's really very dim indeed. And I think he is an anti-Semite, as Stephen does, but I don't think Jeremy Corbyn realises he is.
I think that's exactly right.
I think it's quite possible to believe something and not know you think it.
It's like people it's like people who are sexist who don't realise they're sexist. It's just you can't even explain it to them.
So.
Can I
Right,
just
thanks.
come back on your point about...
Go on, Stephen. Let's hear from
Calm
Stephen.
down, dear.
I take your point about momentum, and that a lot of the young activists are, admirable and fired up, and they just want better housing, better opportunities, that kind of stuff, and that's it's entirely wonderful. But in a way, I think that is a bit starry-eyed in that, and I realise Twitter and social media are not exactly representative, but they are for a generation, for a certain generation. Now, I have a party trick. I block I've got about 2,000 people on Twitter that I checked it this morning that I've blocked, who are a range of fruitcakes and anti-Semites and what have you. The vast majority of them have a JC4PM hashtag on their Twitter feed. Now, I have a party trick. If we had the technology, I'd do it now, which is I go onto Twitter as someone else so that these people aren't blocked, and I type in my name, and then I just let the Twitter feed go through. And within, if I'm giving a talk for half an hour or something, within that half an hour, I guarantee you I'll have had at least a dozen JC4PM things coming out with some really pretty hardcore anti-Semitism and vitriol. Even let's leave the partly anti-Semitism for a moment. Just hardcore vitriol for having dared to challenge the mighty Corbyn. And these are, these are not. Some of these are the same wonderful momentum activists, as it were, who have gone into politics because they've been enthused by Corbyn.
On
so it's
that-
not quite as wonderful.
No, before we are going to take some questions. Before we do that, though, I'm curious because all of you have expressed various shades of hostility to Corbyn. What is your account for why he is inspired among those who do support him, this intense devotion? What Stephen says is absolutely right. Anyone who knows the thing, I was on the receiving end of a graphic which depicted truly in Christ-like terms, and it said, the man that has the burdens of the world on his shoulders, how do we help him? And it was a drawing that looked very JC, the other JC-ish, and I don't mean the Jewish Chronicle. And there is a kind of messianic fervour about him, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on what that's about.
I think there are two things there. Firstly, within the Labour Party, Corbyn was the only one who had anything to say. When the last leadership election, the Liz Kendall, Andy Burnham and Yvette Cooper sounded so dry, so technocratic, so uninteresting, so weary. And in that context, a sort of utopian hope and poetry has got something to commend it. I mean, and I don't say that facetiously. Those things are important currencies in politics, and Corbyn had that. So that's part of the inspiration. When you can marry that to a genuine programme with some real hope of enactment, then you've got a very powerful political programme. I don't believe Corbyn has the latter. But the second thing I'd say in defence of Corbyn, which is really to echo Jim O'Neill's point, though Jim O'Neill also went on to say the following day he thinks Corbyn has all the wrong answers, is that Corbyn, like Ed Miliband before him, is posing some questions which are genuine questions, which people know are true.
I think that explains the degree of devotion. I think
There's
the intensity of it.
There's 6 points.
No, I'm
behind
talking
the
about the
opinion poll.
hardcore Corbyn people treated
It's
like an almost religious figure, which we haven't seen in politics before. It's more intense than you got about Ed Miliband or Tony Blair or anyone else.
That's foreign policy.
Okay. Well, we'll hear from
I think there's so much that is very sort of cleverly channeling the 1980s in the sense that the sort of Thatcherite settlement and the Blair sort of Blairite variation on it and then Brown variation on Blair. But if you go back to it, I mean, it really is something. It's like a 1980s theme night. And one of the things I do remember then, particularly growing up, Kwasi, be noted, in the north of the country, was, there was this whole, thing around the miners' strike. If you think back, anyone who's old enough, and I know most of the audience are very young, but, you will remember that there was that slightly, which side are you on, messianic with a nasty undertone to it, but there was also great feeling, great conviction, and a kind of love of the cause. And sometimes I think whoever Phil just said, emotion is a good and useful currency in politics. It's also the one that has the biggest dangers, and I think that's where you might have seen it, isn't it, before, when it was
But there wasn't...
I know Arthur Scargill was not Jeremy Corbyn, but
But there wasn't a Neil
suggesting.
Kinnock colouring book. There wasn't a Michael Foot T-shirt. This is what we all saw in Liverpool. There is a...
Yes, but there was a Che Guevara T-shirt, and it was on a lot of...
Sure,
posters.
Che Guevara, but it's unusual to British politics, and that's what I'm trying to get to.
I think that's what he's channeling.
I think there's something something of the romantic revolutionary about Corbyn. All his life, he's affiliated himself to causes that were, not mainstream, sort of idealistic in a kind of student politics sort of a way, the sort of politics that doesn't take into account any of the hard facts or the need to actually have an economy or, pay people or any of those things. It's all just lovely sort of, we're all having a great time in a field. And I think so that romantic...
You could be describing here. You just described the Cleveland Festival.
I think he plugs into that a little bit. There's,
right.
everything about him is the path of least resistance. I'm going to say the nice thing about this person, the nice thing about that. It's just there's no kind of cold hard logic to
I
anything.
just thought something important to ask to Stephen before we open out. Has it been a shock to you, Stephen, not the evidence that your paper and others have gathered on an anti-Semitism in Labour and that Corbyn's directly linked with, but the fact that it hasn't been disqualifying for a British party leader? In other words, there you are, you've set out the evidence that says, as you put it, evidence that draws this conclusion about anti-Semitism for him, and yet you haven't had the country say, well, in that case, we must reject it.
I think things are changing slightly. We've been bashing away at this for, as I say, since he was elected in September 2015. And there were moments for the first 2 years or so where, 2.5 years, where you'd occasionally get coverage for things that you revealed and so on. But you never got the feeling that anyone was that interested in it. That changed with the mural, the revelation that he'd written on Facebook, if you remember, saying it was important that an anti-Semitic, and obviously anti-Semitic mural shouldn't have been pulled down. That got a lot of coverage. And then the whole row over the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. In a way, it was sort of in the mainstream media non-stop. And what I heard at the time, this was in March, the revelation about the mural, was that there was no cut-through for this at all and that actually people weren't that interested. And there was a poll, I remember, that showed people ranked, people were asked a list of concerns that they had, and one of which was Corbyn and anti-Semitism, which was, I think, 5% or something, and it was underneath the weather, which was profoundly dispiriting. But all the polling evidence that I've seen, all the focus groups, all the polls, in the last month or two, people have started to say there's cut-through, that people have started to notice it. And there was a story in last week's Sunday Times, a YouGov poll that had been commissioned by this Labour Against Anti-Semitism group, which is on Twitter, which was, if I was a Corbyn official, as it were, I'd have been profoundly disturbed by, which asked people what they associated with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and the biggest thing that people associate, I think it was I got these figures wrong, but it was in the order of sort of 52-53% was anti-Semitism, and the next thing down, 39%, was nothing. So it does seem that it's starting to get some kind of cut through.
Okay, let's hear some questions and contributions from you in our remaining quarter of an hour or so. I'll take groups of sort of 2 or 3 and then we'll bring it back here. And as you would expect from the Guardian man, I would like a gender balance rather than, glad for 3 men out of 3. So we're not getting the gender balance yet, but we'll start off with these 3 and then I encourage women to come forward with questions. Yeah.
Yes, if you're going to say you have to respect the results of the referendum, then you also have to remember that in 1975 we had a referendum to remain in the common market. And that referendum was won not 52-48, but 65-35. What I'm saying is that you can talk about Canada, you can talk about Norway, but I think that the British electorate voted to be in the common market or the European Economic Community, and that whatever we negotiate now should take that into account.
Thank you. And just behind you, I think we'll pass it just behind. Other hands coming out? Yes, we'll hear from here and then the lady there, yeah.
Interested in the panel's views on who will be the next Tory leader / Prime Minister and who should be the next.
Very nice. I've started a trend. I like it.
Trending on Twitter.
Keep your hand up, the lady there. If you keep your hand up so we can get the microphone to you. This will be the last of this round and then we'll come around. Yeah.
There seems to be a consensus, except for the chair, that it's anti-democratic to have another referendum. But what about the people, not the people who are pro-Remain, but there seems to be a growing number of people who voted Brexit, not a significant number yet, but it's growing, who voted Brexit but now have changed their mind because circumstances have changed and so much has been revealed about what's involved that wasn't clear before. It's not that they were stupid, it's that they just didn't know. Why is it anti-democratic to think again?
This is the regrexit factor. I'm going to put that to you first, actually, because Theresa May didn't hesitate to say, we had a general election in 2015, 2 years have passed, we'll have another one in 2017. The democratic will is not static, and therefore we had a vote in 2016. The questioner says lots of new evidence has come to light, and you might think of Toyota and Siemens and Airbus and the difficulty of getting a deal, and say, 2 years on, the democratic stream has moved on, we need to dip our toe in again.
Well, this reminds me very much of the Scottish independence referendum. And ahead of that, they said this would settle the question for a generation. And the whole reason why the Conservative Party wanted to put forward this referendum was to settle this question. There was a sort of finality about, and we all knew about that. We campaigned for 4 months, and it never ended. I was involved in a minor way in the campaign, and it was the dullest campaign I've ever been involved in. I mean, we were just rehearsing all of these issues for 4 months, and there was a view. And many people thought that Remain would win. They thought, well, right, Remain will win, and then we've settled this and we don't have to revisit it. Yeah. And that was the assumption. And now, of course, when the wrong result, in inverted commas, happened, everyone is suggesting that we should rerun it. And I always said before the result that whichever way it went, I would go with that. So I said explicitly, if Remain wins, we've settled that issue, and we should go with it. I'm sure Farage would have campaigned for another referendum, but I would have been against him on that. And it's exactly the same case the other way around. I think we should just try and make the best of it, because it was a big constitutional issue. Someone mentioned 1975. That's 43 years ago. I was born in 1975. And that feels like a very long time ago to me.
Doesn't feel that long ago.
No, maybe not to you, but you know, the idea that just because we had a vote in 75, it was a completely different kettle of fish.
Let me pick up something that's there from 1975, which is the idea that was a vote, as I understood it, you were saying, to be specifically in a European economic area. There is this view that the EEA membership is the best reflection, not only of 75, but even of 2016, in this sense, which is it was such a narrow vote, 52-48. Single market customs union were not on the ballot paper. And the best way, and even Daniel Hannan, a big lever, says a reflection of the narrowness, which would say, you know, let's be a little bit out, would be to say, leave the European Union, the political structures, but stay in the customs union single market. And that would be true to 75 and true even to 2016. Since you sort of articulated that position before, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, I think if that option were available, that would be the one I would like, given that we've got to leave the European Union. The two questions on the referendum pose a very interesting conundrum, which is how long should a referendum last for? Now, there's no answer to that question in constitutional theory. It's a political answer, but it's a very important one, because 1975, it's a long time ago. Probably that's a question where the electorate is so sufficiently different now that it's reasonable to pose it again. Is it reasonable that we should pose the question that we posed in 2016? Well, it's certainly not anti-democratic. I think that's a really foolish description, because to describe as non-democratic a vote of the people is preposterous. The question is more subtle than that, which is it time to have another one? I agree, if there were evidence of significant change of heart on the basis of evidence which has come in the interim, that might furnish a reason for doing it again. So I'm not vehemently opposed to it, I just don't see such evidence. And I worry about the consequences of a second vote, which did then reverse the first one. I worry that the politics in the wake of that would be extremely toxic and divisive. And so therefore I fear and I regret that this might be a mistake we'll have to learn by making.
Okay, and quickly on this.
Very quickly, yeah. Phil just made my last point. So I think if you really want to see kind of Trumpishness descend on Britain, you'd be very careful what you wish for in assuming that you get this technocratic second vote that just decides the question. You won't. You'll get an awful lot more besides. I certainly don't think it's to the ladies' point. I don't think it's anti-democratic. I think there's just a question of, well, you know, to flip it onwards. Then could we go back in another 5 years and have another run at it? I mean, at what point? You have to. I think you have have to have some concept that a question is settled. The only other way that I do think we are being a bit supine about, both in the negotiations and just generally perhaps our own mindset, is we need to just be more forthcoming with Europe. It's not just our problem. This is really potentially a big problem for the whole continent and for liberal democracy on the continent. And I think there's a bit of a self-hating Britishness that sometimes just gets tangled up with the fact it's all interior, it's all our fault, and we just have to keep taking that argument back out there. If you want Norway, just continue to fight for it. Don't cringe.
I think, just want to very quickly, I think it would just prolong the agony. I mean, I think we just need to get on with it, and whatever we get, make the best of it. I think having another referendum just revisits, it just opens up the wound again, and everybody will, start shouting at each other. And the vote was what the vote was. It wasn't what some people wanted. It's gone the way it's gone. Let's try and get a deal.
Should we just do our own little mini referendum in here? I'm just curious on this one point. On whether or not you would like there to be a people's vote or not. So whether there should be another referendum. So all those who think there should be another referendum, it's people's vote so-called, good chunk. And then all those who think there absolutely should not be a second referendum, more think there shouldn't be. Interesting. Okay, we've been very high-minded at this end of the room by resisting the temptation to tackle this question about who will be the next Conservative leader after Theresa May and who should be. So why don't we start with you, Stephen? Who should be and who will be?
I think it's... To me, the only thing that matters is finding... It's a bit obvious, this. The only thing that matters is finding someone who can beat Jeremy Corbyn. As things stand now, I think probably the best chance, given his story and so on, is Sajid Javid. To me, he seems like he's the most credible candidate. But, a lot will depend on timing, and I think there's a case to be made for going for a much younger generation, although they're not tested, so you don't know. But
Sarah, I saw you nodding there, slightly in the manner of an Oscar nominee who smiles when someone else picks up Best Actor. So, who will be the next leader after Theresa May?
I think
and who should be?
If you take a snapshot of it now, I think it would definitely be Sajid. I think, although never underestimate the capacity of the Home Office to ruin your political career. Amber Rudd, she was in that position a year ago, and look what happened to her. So obviously, it's only ever a snapshot in time. But I think Sajid is a pretty good bet, and he's a good man, and he has a good following, and he brings a lot of people together, which is the key thing that the Tory party really need at the moment. They do not need another divisive leader.
And he would be somebody who could bring people together, you think?
I think so, yeah.
Interesting.
Definitely.
Kwasi?
I agree.
Again, you all have a vote.
I agree. I mean, look, I've been in this game long enough. There have been about 15 potential leaders and favourites. And then one week it's Amber Rudd, and the next week it's Stephen Crabb, remember him? He was going to be the next leader.
I don't think he was ever a favourite.
And no, he was very high up. And Bruce Anderson was writing articles about how this is the next Prime Minister and all the rest of it. And there've been literally about a dozen of these people. George Osborne was a shoo-in. Boris Johnson was a shoo-in. Yeah. At the moment, in terms of where the wheel is, I think Sajid is in a very good position. But in 12 months' time, it could be in a totally
the really
different
worrying
place.
thing is that he's top of the poll on Conservative Home, which is when things start to go wrong. So like when you're top of the poll, you're like, oh no, it's a disaster.
So this thing can flip around. I think he'd be very good, but actually I think there are a lot of people who would be quite good. I think Jeremy Hunt wouldn't be a bad leader. I can see Penny Mordaunt is coming up. I think she's got interesting things to say. So I think there are a number of people who could do the job. And as Theresa May would say, there isn't a vacancy at the moment. So
I think it's also about what team they could put together. I think that's really, really important because I think that it feels like this particular sort of government structure, everybody's been a bit sort of on their, you really want a coherent team, don't you? And I think that's why Sajid or Jeremy would be very good at that as well. I mean, surviving 5 years in the Department of Health without making any serious major mistakes is actually quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, they're both capable politicians.
He's a very capable person.
I think that there are many, the two candidates, Sajid and Jeremy, have been mentioned, who look very plausible from a Conservative Party point of view. I would still, need more proof that they could go out there and win an election, which is what you'd need them to do in very short order. I'm not convinced at all that they've got the fire to do that. I think Ruth Davidson would have been rocket fuel for the Tory project. Obviously, a very sensible woman, because she said, I don't want it, thanks. I'm going to, an interesting life as a backseat driver and, plough my own. Of course, I think she'll be a very important thinker, however, in the project, and that she may be able to be pulled into it in some way.
The premise there of what you're saying is that you believe her, that you think she really is ruling herself out. You don't think it's just a feint.
I don't think it's a feint. No. I think we tried so hard, in the wicked mainstream media, to get her to want something that she's actually. The weird thing she never said is that she really wanted it. So we just kept wanting it to be true. I think she may well want to play a role, but I think she's quite wedded to Scottish politics for now, and I think she might. Sarah mentioned the idea of the sort of team of rivals, very important. One could see her playing a role on that, but I don't think she wants to leave.
She's so young, she's one of the things she said is that she wants to see her kids grow up. Well, she could see her kids grow up and still then be a contender.
Yes.
And one thing we forget is how impossible it is now to be the leader of a party and how it destroys your life almost completely and your family's life and all your. It is not. It's not. You'd have to think very long and hard. I think she's right. I think Ruth Davidson is right. It is. I can't tell you, even just in the context of my own existence, which is much further down the food chain, the stuff that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's just exhausting.
Like what?
And it's all social media driven. Well, it's just, like today, Michael's had 500 Corbynistas ringing him up and telling him he's this, that and the other because they've leaked the details of his phone. The other day, my children were trying to get to school and they couldn't get out the front door because the man was digging up the road, and then there were a whole load of reporters. They're tiny little things. Individually, you take them and they're all fine and you can deal with them. But it's when you put them all together and you suddenly your head explodes. And so I think, you have to be a very, I used to think that Theresa May was actually in a very good position to do what she's doing because she doesn't have children. She's free to do it 24 hours a day, which is really what you need to be able to do. You literally need to be able to do it every single waking hour, and you cannot think about anything else because the stuff that you're trying to cope with is so gigantic. And I do think that Ruth is right. If she wants to have healthy, happy children who have any chance at all of growing up to be normal human beings, then she's probably right to rule it out for now. I'm not saying she couldn't come back to it, but I think, it's difficult. It's very difficult. In that respect, Boris is probably in quite a good place because, he's sort of...
Freed himself up.
Very good.
Quickly, I think it should be Ruth Davidson, and if I were a senior member of the Tory party, I'd say, yeah, it's all very well, there's interviews, yeah, lovely, but you don't mean it, come on, you're going to be Prime Minister. But I think it won't be, so it's more likely to be Sajid Javid or Jeremy Hunt. But everything in British politics depends on what happens on the European Union, and so does this. So if the Conservative Party is not yet ready to draw a line under that dreadful schism and talk about something else, then it would have to be someone from the other side of that argument. And in those circumstances, Boris Johnson is probably still in the running, and the estimable Michael Gove may yet be in the running too.
He's not allowed.
Banning it. We got a story at the end. It took an hour and 5 minutes, but we got there. Sarah's banned Michael Gove from becoming Prime Minister. We are, I'm afraid, out of time, but I'm sure, two things to mention. I think those people on this panel have written books. We'll be signing them, I'm told, in the book selling area.
Mainly Phil Collins.
And you've got a book about speeches. I write books under the name Sam Bourne. And you've written history books, etc. So there's lots there. But mainly, I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking this terrific panel for a very stimulating discussion. Philip Collins, Kwasi Kwarteng, Anne McElvoy, Stephen Pollard, and Sarah Vine. Thank you all very much.
I think they might be on with it, but...